this particular agenda over here, or how to respond to what's happening in our school system. Those are really good and valid and important topics, but I think we do ourselves a bit of a disservice when we start there, because that's the end of the conversation, and when we don't have a solid theology of sex and sexuality to build on how to respond to some of those things, I think we can miss the mark sometimes. So just maybe like a brief 1-minute background. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work primarily with individuals, couples, some adolescents. And the super cool thing that I get to do is practice something called Christian integrative therapy, which means I get to talk about God in the context of therapy and get to mention Jesus by name, which is super cool and awesome. And even all of that, I am not standing before you all as a therapist. I'm standing as a mom, as a parent who is struggling. Well, I don't know if you're struggling, but I struggle. And there's days when, I feel like a rock star parent and like I should probably write like parenting books, like dozens of them. And other days where I am flailing and drowning and can't seem to get anything right. And just thank God that whatever happened in the privacy of my own home and not in public, because I teach parenting classes, and that's embarrassing. So anyways, I'm going to borrow the words of T.D. Niles, who calls Christianity and evangelism as one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And so I'm here as a beggar, hopefully pointing to the true bread, to the bread life, to Christ, and hopefully we can do that piece together. Okay, so we're going to start with some foundational truths, and then we're going to move into like 3 different parts of our talk, our conversation. And these are things that we all have to agree on first before we talk about the 3 main components of our time together. And the first is that you are the parent your child needs. Not a theologian or someone with a PhD degree. You are the parent your child needs. And when we talk about sexuality in particular, oftentimes it's a conversation that we have given to the world, to places outside of our church, outside of our home, our little churches, which are our homes. And the first thing that I'm going to ask us to do is to reclaim that conversation for our homes, for our churches. And that's why we're here, and that's why we're talking about this. And I just want to share with you some research, because this is not Christians trying to convince other Christians to talk to their kids about sexuality. This is secular research that shows parents, and you're going to hear the word relationship over and over and over again in my time, but parents and the overall quality of the relationship are the single largest influence on an adolescent's decisions about sex. And the sad thing, though, is that parents underestimate the impact that they have on their teen's decision. And so when they do research and they ask teens, who helped form your idea of sexuality and sex? It's not the school system. It's not their friends. It's actually the parents. And we forget the really huge role and responsibility that we have in that. So we all agree on this. Like, I need affirmation. Okay, we all agree that you are the parent your child needs, and that this is the most important thing that we can do to cultivate our child's idea of sexuality and sexual wholeness. Okay, the second thing that I hope we all can agree on is that there's one source of truth. And move through this one quickly, because I think we all agree. But, oftentimes because sexuality is such a big and loaded topic, there's a lot of feelings, there's a lot of emotions around this. Sexuality is powerful. It's often described like, if you have like a really strong current or river with boundaries, it can give life, but without boundaries, it can flood a town or a village. So there's something very powerful about sexuality, and that's why we have a lot of feelings about sexuality, because it can produce some very hurtful, negative, and shameful things for us. But even in all of that, the truth is not based on our feelings about sexuality. It's not based on science, as much as we love science, and it can psychology can help inform our understanding. It's not based on that. It's not based on relativism, on cultural trends. There's only one source of truth, and that's the Word of God. And it's, again, hopefully what we're going to be doing today is really honing in on that. All right, so some other pieces that I'm hoping we can all agree on, is that your child is a sexual being, okay? Your child does not become a sexual being the very first time he or she experiences a sexual thought or begins to have sexual desire. They are born gendered. They are born as a sexual being, male and female. He created them. And oftentimes we forget just how incredibly important that is, because it's going to inform the kind of conversations that we begin to have about sexuality from the very beginning, okay? And what we say and don't say oftentimes. Okay, the second thing is that the body is good. Okay, the body is good, and church fought a lot of heresies to reclaim that truth. Okay, the body is good. Ask St. Cyril. They say, like, ask a dead body to sin. It can't. Okay, so the body in and of itself is not sinful. And sexual curiosity is natural. Okay, I'm going to repeat that one again. Sexual curiosity is natural. Okay, and why is this important? Because when we have really little ones and they're trying to understand their bodies, why dad has a penis and mom has a vagina, and we have our own shame and guilt around these kinds of topics, and we say, hey, we don't ask about that, we don't talk about that. And we've right off the bat disconnected them from their bodies, disconnected them from the part of their sexual thought process that's very natural and hasn't been tainted with all of these things that we're so scared that they're going to be exposed to. But we've done them a real disservice for not being able to enter into these conversations with openness, with curiosity, with honesty, and to acknowledge that their natural sexual curiosity is just that, natural. So do we all agree so far? You're welcome to throw things and share your disagreement or rebellion if something doesn't sit well with you. But I do want to make sure that we can all agree on some of these foundational truths. Okay, and the third is that sex is good and designed by God to serve a purpose, and we're going to talk quite a lot about that. And that sexuality tells us something about God and ourselves. Okay, that sexuality, outside of just being something that we can experience within our bodies, has something profoundly spiritual tied to it. So we don't disconnect those two things. We don't want to just live in the spirituality of it all and disconnect ourselves from something very physical about sex and sexuality, but those two things are very real. Okay, we all agree? We're good? Okay, I like the head nods. All right, so as we get started, and what we're going to call is an ongoing conversation around sexuality, because it's not just one. This is not a talk about how to have the sex talk, okay? And check off a box and say, I did it. It was horrible and awkward, but I did it. And then, I did one follow-up, so I'm really awesome. And so that's not it, right? It's an ongoing. That's why we call it sexual discipleship. So I want us to reframe the way that we think about this, right? Because the way we think about this is going to determine how we speak to our children and what we share and don't share. Okay? And there's three main components to this, and you have to go in order. You can't go out of order, okay? And the first is to know God, and to know God. And not just what God says about sexuality and sex, but to be in relationship with God, because none of this works, none of this matters, if it's not rooted in our deep, real, and intimate relationship with our Lord and Savior, okay? That's the first and foremost. The second is to know ourselves. So oftentimes we want to jump into having these conversations with our children on a topic that we ourselves haven't worked out, okay? Because oftentimes we are experiencing our own sexual shame and things in our past and our history that we haven't worked through. And I can tell you the countless times that, I have married women in therapy who come in and, for their whole lives, they've heard sex is bad, don't do it, outside of marriage, don't do this. And it's like this whole complex. And then they get married and it's supposed to be wonderful and good and it's supposed to be ecstasy and all these things. And then all of a sudden they can't make that switch, right? They can't disconnect this negative theology of sex that they've had their whole life and all of a sudden have the freedom to enjoy it in the bounds of marriage. And it's really troublesome. There's a lot of shame to that. It's just one example of how that can sometimes play out. So we have to know ourselves, and we'll talk just a little bit about that. And then we have to know our child. And again, not just know the developmental pieces of it and how to talk at each of those levels, but to be in relationship with our children. Because if you talk about the sex talk, or if you do the sex talk rather, and you do all the things, and again, it's not rooted in deep, real relationship, you're going to miss the mark. So you're going to get sick of that word, relationship, but I really hope and pray it just settles deep, deep in our souls today. Okay, so the first piece, to know God, okay, to know God. And to know what God says about sexuality, we have to start at the very beginning. And I'm going to try to move a little quickly through this just for the sake of time. But we know that in the very beginning, God created man and woman in his own image, in his image and likeness. And what did he say when he created Adam and Eve? And all of creation, really. What did he say? it was good. It was good. He didn't say it was good except this whole sex thing that I kind of had to do, right? Like, no, it was good. All of it was good. In fact, one was the only and first time that God said, it is not good. You can cheat, it's right up there. It's when Adam was alone. It wasn't until Adam was alone that God said, well, this is not good. Adam needs companionship. Adam needs someone who can do life with him, okay? It wasn't, oh, well, hey, this sexuality thing, this one's not good. And we have to really try to examine our theology of sex, because I really appreciate this quote. I'm going to go over here, and I'll go back to the other one, by someone named Don Schrader. He's not a Christian. He's commenting on Christians. And he says, to hear many religious people talk, one would think God created the torso, head, legs, and arms, but the devil slapped on the genitals. And I'm sorry, I know that's a little crude, but that's kind of like some of us really examine the way that we think sometimes. It's like, oh, like all of that, like that belongs to God. Like, you know, just the marriage, the beauty of that. Like, yeah, but this thing over here, like, what do we do with that? Okay, maybe that's of the world. That's not of God. Because we have to really examine our theology when it comes to that. And so we know in Genesis 20:24 that God did have a divine purpose and intent for sexuality, and it was one that is exercised in the context of marriage. You know, one element of our sexuality, because you're still a sexual being. Remember, even if you're not married, if you're a single person, you're still sexually whole. You don't become sexually whole when you enter into a marital relationship, okay? Monks and nuns, they are sexually whole people, okay? They don't need marriage or sexual intercourse to become sexually whole. So the idea of cultivating sexual wholeness isn't tied to the act of sex. It's tied to our understanding and our theology and the relationship in which it points to our relationship with God. Okay, so the two shall become one flesh. Okay, and that's really the intent and the divine purpose. And we're going to talk a little more on that. And St. John Chrysostom does have something to answer to John Schrader. He says, from the beginning, God has been revealed as the fashioner of this union of man and woman. And he has spoken of the two as one. There is never such intimacy between a man and a woman as there is between man and wife, if they are united as they ought to be. Okay, as they ought to be, that's kind of a key sentence there. For truly, this love is more despotic than any despotism, and speaks to the authority of that. Other desires may be strong, but this one alone never fades, for this love is deeply planted within our nature, which is imperceptibly to ourselves attracts the bodies of men and women to each other. Do you see the close bond and connection, and how God did not allow anything from the outside to come between them? Nothing so welds our lives together as the love of man and woman. Okay? So you hear from the very beginning, this is the union that God has fashioned. Our sexuality, sexual intimacy within marriage, it's not an afterthought. It's a part of God's divine plan and intent. And, you know, there is some differing thoughts, whether Adam and Eve knew each other in that way in the Garden of Eden, or God would have maybe had a different means of procreation. Like, that's beyond, as Archie would say, my pay grade to speak into that. But I will recommend a really awesome book by Father Lawrence Farley, and we do have it in the resource table. And he goes through the theology of sex during creation and the fall. And he is a priest in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's a really, really great read if you're interested. He speaks a lot about the Church Fathers too as well. Because if you're like me, and your relationship with the Church Fathers is sometimes Googling things of like, what did the Church Fathers say about this? It can be a little bit confusing and almost contradictory when you hear some of the things that they say about sex and sexuality. And you know, honestly, and I love Father Lawrence for speaking to this, because oftentimes we miss the context. You know, so when St. John Chrysostom is talking to celibates, and he's trying to encourage them in their virginity, he's not espousing the merits of marriage and trying to weigh out the pros and cons. Like, he's just encouraging them in their walk. okay? And it can almost seem like anti-marriage or anti-sexuality, but it's not. It's the intent and the heart for what he's speaking to is very different. When he's speaking to, married couples, and speaking to the intimacy of marriage, you see here how he elevates it and how he speaks to the profound love that can be expressed within the context of marriage. So, how are we doing so far? Everyone can agree that, we're in a good place when it comes to some of our theological understanding of this, and we're going to piece it out just a little bit more, but I just want to make sure that we all feel good so far. Okay, awesome. So, I want to give us some working definitions to work with, and that way we have something to kind of hold on to as we begin to inform our own theology of sexuality. Okay, so our sexuality is part of the divine intent for humanity. We already spoke to that just a little bit, right? It is part of the divine intent, and it is a sacred gift to be expressed within the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that radical monogamy means, okay? Sexuality is sacramental. It reflects the mystical union between Christ and the church, and is most fully realized within the sacrament of marriage. Please just don't misquote me on this. I'm not saying sex is a sacrament. It's not it, but it's sacramental. Our sexuality is sacramental, and that a sacrament is a mystery. Okay, it's a mystery that speaks to something that's maybe physical or real, that's tangible, but it's speaking to something that's a spiritual truth that's hard for us oftentimes to perceive without the material and the tangible and the physical, right? That's what we'd call the Eucharist, for example. It's a mystery because we don't fully understand it. Okay, it's something that is again beyond us. And I love how Father Tom Hopko explains this. He's was a priest in the Greek Orthodox Church. And he would give this example, if you had someone come and visit your church and they wanted to get to know Christ or wanted to be in relationship with God, the first thing that you would do would not be take them to communion, would not be to go and experience the Eucharist, right? Because the Eucharist is something that's reserved for the believers. It's something exclusive in some ways, right? After we're baptized, after we have the seal of chrismation, and then we can experience the fullness of the Eucharist. If you experience the Eucharist, not being a believer, not being somebody who has entered into the body of Christ, well, the Eucharist is going to mean something very different for you, and it's not going to be the Eucharist, really, if you think about it, okay? And he says it's something very similar to the way that we understand sexuality and sexual union in the context of marriage, okay? It is exclusive. It is something that is reserved for the union between man and wife, between husband and wife, rather, and it is something that is sacramental. Okay. Sexuality is an expression of divine love. And this is the piece of the spirituality that we have to begin to really understand, right? It speaks to who God is in our life. And oftentimes when you see the imagery that's in the Old Testament, when God speaks of idolatry, what does he call it? Adultery, right? Idolatry is really adultery in the Old Testament. Why? Because oftentimes God would speak to his relationship between him and the Israelites, between him and his people, as that of a husband and wife. So it was God's fidelity, it's God's faithfulness, and it's modeled throughout Scripture time and time again. Now obviously, the Israelites, God's people, as we do, we fall short of that. But he gave us sexuality to help us to understand that divine love and that divine purpose within the bounds of sexuality. And it allows married couples to experience mutual pleasure, yes, mutual pleasure, and embody self-giving, sacrificial love that mirrors God's love for humanity. So again, that's the connection. That's the piece that helps us to understand the spirituality behind sexual union. And then lastly, because we can't miss the very real reason of sex too, which is it's procreative and it's unitive. I like to joke that one time I'm going to write a book that says sex, you wouldn't be here without it, right? We all are a product of that sexual union between mom, dad, and there's something very real, again, intangible about sex. And it serves both the purpose of procreation and the deepening of the marital bond, participating in God's creative work, which is really cool, that we get to be co-laborers in God's creativity, right? And there's something very spiritual, I think, about that as well. So how are we doing so far about those spiritual truths? Okay, it's good, it's foundational. Hopefully it's a little bit of a different way of understanding our sexuality. Okay, awesome. All right, so this is a term that I'm borrowing from Father Tom Hopko, which is radical monogamy. And this is what he speaks to when he talks about marriage. It's radical monogamy. And it's really, really hard to talk about sexuality without talking about marriage. Okay, and it's really hard to talk about sexual union without talking about marriage and without talking about gender, really, but we just don't have the time and the scope to talk about those two big pieces of it, right? And so that's the piece of the exclusivity of it all. When I gave you the example of the Eucharist and the sexual union between married couples. All right, so this is a quote from Father Lawrence that I really love, because oftentimes when we speak to our children, when we teach in Sunday school, we'll say sex before marriage is wrong, sex before marriage is wrong, and we kind of just like leave it at that. It's a sin, just don't do it, okay? It's bad for you, it taints you, it taints your perception of your future marriage, all these things. And I love how Father Lawrence words it. He says, casual sex is not so much wrong as impossible and a contradiction in terms. Sexual intercourse is not casual and never can be. It is profound, for it involves opening ourselves up, even if for a brief moment or brief time, in complete vulnerability to the other. It involves sharing on the deepest physical and psychological levels. So I love this idea that, when we think about casual sex, it's not something that's like those two things don't go together. It's an impossible term because sexuality, as God intended it, it's exclusive and it's meant to be something that deepens a relationship that's committed within the context of radical monogamy. So when we reevaluate that idea of it's wrong before marriage, let's not leave this part out of why it doesn't work. When I have women that come in therapy and they're trying to explore do I have sex with my boyfriend? Why not? And we explore that piece of the vulnerability that occurs, right, between two people who are engaged in sexual intercourse or, in any kind of sexual activity. It's really dangerous without that containment of the commitment, right? It's really dangerous without something that says, I'm here and we can work through the difficult pieces. Well, if it's hard and something doesn't work and I'm out, there's something very painful then about that sexual experience. So again, let's reorient ourselves just a little bit when we talk about why is sex wrong before marriage. Okay, so in the second piece, to know ourselves. So if we feel like, hey, I get it, I get some of those theological pieces of what sexuality is, its divine purpose, its intent, what does it mean then to know ourselves? Okay, so one thing to note. We are always communicating when it comes to our sexuality, when it comes to our perception of other people's sexuality. There's an axiom in communications theory that says you cannot not communicate. Okay, you cannot not communicate. Okay, you're a human being, you're communicating something on some level at all times. Okay, and so there's something called explicit communication, and this means that we have direct and clear discussions about gender and sexuality with our children, and these conversations may involve providing information, answering questions, and sharing our beliefs and values. That's what most of us perceive as, real communication. But there's implicit communication, and this refers to the indirect or subtle ways in which we communicate about gender and sexuality. So it may not be directly stated, and it could be conveyed through our actions, our attitudes, what we choose not to talk about, right? We see something, we don't say it, or, there's pieces of us that get communicated in those responses, and the environment, our environment that we create at home is communicating something to our children, okay? So keep that piece in the back of your mind as we then talk about knowing ourselves. So I want to just give you a minute to pause and reflect, okay? What messages did you grow up hearing about sex, okay? What was the messaging? What was the communication? Both the explicit communication, right, what was verbally stated, and what was implicitly communicated to you? Was sex something dirty and shameful? Was it something that, you could never talk about? Were you able to ask questions, or who did you ask questions to if you had questions? That's that piece of us thinking some of that through. It's going to tell us where we have spiritual maturity and where we get things right. And then it's also going to point and to indicate some things to us that maybe we're lacking and we need to really explore with whether it's in community or a trusted spiritual mentor or your spiritual father or a trusted Christian counselor, like whoever it might be, these are some of the pieces that we need to start thinking through, like what it is that I'm still holding on to when it comes to my sexuality. And how do I, again, view my own body and sexuality and its purpose, right? If I have sexual shame, I really need to be able to deal with that before I speak to my children about sexuality, right? It's going to show up some way, somehow, in how I communicate. Okay, so this is a quote from Dr. Julie Slattery that I really love, and she has a great book called Rethinking Sexuality. And it says, 2 of the greatest challenges surrounding sexuality are convincing single Christians to abstain from sex and convincing married Christians to enjoy sex. And you're allowed to laugh at that one, because I always wonder, I have some more spicy quotes that I choose not to include sometimes, but this is like the G-rated spicy quotes that I feel okay. I feel okay with. And so that's the thing, like we struggle with telling single Christians, like, hey, there's something good and precious here, but it's boundaried and it needs to be expressed in something really real and profound. And then, hey, when you do have this really special commitment in marriage, then what do you do with your sexuality? And so part of the knowing self, if you're here and you're married, is being able to explore, what does my married sex life look like? Is it one of open, loving, healthy communication? I'm not saying you have to have a perfect sex life. That's not how it works. But is it one where you get to deepen the marital bond by walking through this journey together? Okay? So, to know your child. And this one's a really big one. And I know we're like so short on time. So I'm going to try to rush, but hopefully we still get you out relatively on time. Okay. So what we want to avoid when we talk to our children about sexuality is something that Father Lawrence calls, which is self-righteous externalism. We do not want children that look good on the outside when it comes to their sexuality. Okay, and we don't want them to believe that they have some self-righteous thing in them because they're not that person over there that's dealing with same-sex attraction or that's struggling with their promiscuity or whatever it might be. So we want to avoid this idea that we are like manipulating our children's sexual world so that it looks good and that we look good in turn in our parenting. We want them to have something much deeper in their understanding of sexuality than something that, again, just looks good on the outside. So we want to work towards sexual wholeness. And that includes not just what our children think about sex, but how our children think about sex. Because if we're just feeding them information, but we're not giving them the framework for how to then process something that's new, because they're going to deal with something new. Like, you cannot equip them for every single thing that's going to happen and everything that they're going to encounter. If you equip them for yesterday, then tomorrow is going to be 10 times different. Like, you can't keep up. I can't keep up. Okay? So we want to create an atmosphere that, again, welcomes these topics with curiosity, is, again, attuned to our children's developmental milestones and their ideas and perceptions of sexuality, and that promotes self-reflection and critical thinking. I'm going to try to move a little quickly. So this is a really awesome chart that I love by 2 Christian therapists that are also Christian sex therapists, the Penners, and I'll share these if you're any of the slides in the email if you're curious. But this speaks to all the developmental milestones that our children are experiencing when it comes to their sexual development and what our role is as parents in each of those stages. And so it really does begin at infancy, because remember, your child was born as a sexual being. They don't become a sexual being. They are born a sexual being. And so in the very beginning, we're focused on bonding and attachment, and we're telling them that, touch is safe. People who love you can touch you in boundaried, safe ways. It's just simple as that. You don't speak that to your infant, but you hold them when they cry. Okay, you respond to them when they need you. Okay, and you go into toddlerhood, and it's really, really then important to begin naming genitals for what they are. Boys have penises, girls have vaginas. I can tell you so many funny stories with my children when we were going through that stage, and the public humiliation and embarrassment that would come from, inappropriate times of using some of these words. But that's a part of the process, is helping them understand, this is your body, and there's nothing shameful about that, but there's certain contexts in which this is a private conversation, right? And so we balance that piece, we toe the line in a lot of ways. And you have to be careful where you kind of maybe are leaning one way or the other. And I'm going to try to move a little quickly. We move towards preschool age, and we're really answering a lot of questions at that point, right? Like it is a ton of questions and being really open and honest in our communication. And then when our children enter into school age, they are then beginning to explore this idea of like, hey, I look different, my body looks different than not just me as a boy, versus this girl over here or my sibling, but boys in their classrooms are some 1 foot taller than the other. Like they're trying to understand their bodies in general. It's not just all about sexuality, it's about understanding their physical being, okay? And so we talk about boundaries, we talk about our own sexual awareness, we speak about all of those things without shame. So remember, if we're harboring our own sexual shame, if we haven't dealt with that, it's going to seep into how we parent and how we speak to our children about this. And then with pre-adolescents, I love what they call this. This is the bumbling discovery, right? Like, who here remembers junior high? Gosh, junior high. It's like, junior high was hard. Okay, so our kids going through junior high are, they're trying to figure themselves out. They're struggling, their voice are cracking, things are happening. Your child who used to smell like a bed of flowers now stinks. Like, all these things that are happening, and you're trying to figure out, okay, like, how do I respond? Well, we respond by knowing God, being in relationship with Him. We respond by knowing ourselves and knowing our places where we're getting it right and where we might be kind of needing to do our own self-growth and our work, and then knowing our child, okay? So there's never like these clear-cut, easy answers for a lot of these things, but we are affirming all their God-given qualities. We're helping them understand themselves in that process. And then when they're entering into adolescence, we really are launching them into the world, and we're hoping that they have the autonomy and the mind of Christ, really, to be able to answer for themselves and to move through life in a way that is honoring the values and the gifts that you have given them with the relationship that you have modeled with Christ, with your spouse, with your partner, and the little church at home, okay? And we can't control actions. I don't know. Anyways, like, we don't have a ton of time to talk about this. So parents always want to ask me, like, what's the right time to talk about sex, to ask some of those questions of our children of like, hey, like, what are you curious about, and all of these things. And, I would say, just, even though there's no right or wrong time, that when your child begins having access to the internet, okay, especially, there are some conversations that you really need to start having, because it's incredibly important that we're not just giving them what's good and godly, but we're helping them guard their eyes and their ears. And we have some great books in the resource table too. One of them is called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and it talks you through how to talk about pornography. It's a book you read with your kids. It's really, really great, and I recommend it. And so we're aware of our child's developmental level, their current level of knowledge. Like, if they're here, we don't start there. Okay, and if you're here, if your child is here because some of the things that they've been exposed to, or an older sibling, or some of the things that my children come home and like, hey, what does this mean? And you're like, oh, okay, here we go. You can't start down here. So if you have to meet your child. I have to meet my child where they're at. So again, it's that attunement to their own development. But one note I will say, and I think Archie touched on this just a little bit, like, we can't wait till high school anymore, right? This idea of like waiting till our children are more aware of their sexual feelings and desires, or are we're more aware of their sexual feelings and desires, probably a more apt way of saying that. Well, here's the few things that happen to your child's brain when they become an adolescent. At around the age of 13, their brain is doing something really interesting. It's rewiring, it's pruning, it's myelination. They're integrating, becoming more specialized, all these really great, amazing things that God has put in them. But one thing that specifically happens that's noteworthy when it comes to communication is that they begin to tune out their parents. And like, neural imaging actually shows this, like, we're not making it up, okay? And that when they are little, they respond to mom and dad's voice very differently. And then when they become an adolescent, all of a sudden, those regions of the brain don't light up the same way anymore, because God has wired them to want to leave you at one point, okay? So they're interested in new and novel voices, okay? They're curious about what's out there, what the world has to say. But the hope and the prayers that we've instilled them with a fountain, it's not to say they're not listening anymore, Okay, it's not true, but we start to lose the kind of space, I will say, that it occupies in their brain. So if you wait till high school, it's really hard. And the other thing that happens in the adolescent brain, is that they just perceive neutral communication to just be more negative. Okay, so you can say something really, really neutral to your adolescent, and all of a sudden they're up in arms and they're angry, and it's like, whoa, like, where did that come from? Because they actually have a negative bias during adolescence towards communication. So if we keep waiting until that particular time in their development, it's not to say it's impossible, it just gets to be a little bit harder, okay? And we don't want to just give sex education. We want to give them emotional maturity and relational maturity. And I think it's really fascinating. They did this study with a whole bunch of emerging adults, and they asked them what information they wish their parents had taught them, okay? And it was the emotional aspects of having a relationship, a romantic relationship. They felt like their parents did not equip them with how to handle a breakup or how to deal with something that, like, you know, you're trying to figure out, like, well, is this person good to me? Like, should I stay in this relationship? All these pieces that, you know, we kind of miss as we hit, like, the check marks and we say, oh, yeah, I talked about this, I talked about that. But again, that comes from relationship. All right, so I know I said we're not going to talk a lot about broken sexuality, but I do want to mention some pieces of it because I think it's noteworthy. I don't know if you grew up hearing the saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. I heard that often, and I think for some of us, it gave way to a way of understanding broken sexuality that I think maybe can take us down the wrong path at times. And when I heard the revision to this, like, it blew my mind. And so this is now my motto: love the sinner and hate my own sin. Okay? If I can love you and focus on my own sin, then the world would look really different. Then as Christians, like, I set the world on fire in the best way possible, right? But I think that idea of love the sinner, hate the sin, I think can give way to some less than desirable consequences. And so when I say this to clients in therapy, when I say it to adolescents, like, it resonates with them, like, so much. Like, this is it. This is the message of Christianity. Because I don't need to worry about your sin. My own sin is a full-time job, okay? So that's one piece of broken sexuality I wanted to mention as we kind of think through some of those pieces. The other is, I get a lot of questions, I'm sure, like Archie or anyone in here who works in similar field, and it's like, well, do I let my child do this? Do I go to this thing over here? Like, where's the boundary? And we want the red light or the green light. Like, this is the thumbs up, like, go, you know, move forward, or stop. And very few things now are just that clear cut, okay? Of do this, don't do that. There is some very clear boundaries. Don't get me wrong on that piece. But I think, unfortunately, we now live in a world where we're in the middle of, you know, proceed with caution, right? It's yellow light. Stop, think through before, and I think Archie touched on this quite well, of, like, just be careful of the like trigger response, right? It's not always yes, and it's not always no. It's like, just tell me more. And we're going to talk about some pieces of that that I think are really important, which is 3 C's that I want to give you that I think are so important. And if you can do this, you will be golden. If you can respond with calmness, if you can respond with curiosity, and if you can respond with compassion, I don't know how you can go wrong. Like, when I've done these things, I don't go wrong. When one of them is missing, I'm like so off kilter. Okay? So a calm response, one that's curious, tell me more, I don't understand. It's okay to say I don't know. It's okay to say help me get it. And one that's compassionate. Our children are allergic to a response that is devoid of love and devoid of God's heart. They smell it from a mile away. So if we can season our responses with calmness, with curiosity, and with compassion, we'll go really far. And I wanted to give you an example of the iceberg because I think oftentimes when it comes with, you know, political agendas and all these things, like, we live on the top 10% and we respond to the anger of the pronouns and the this and the politics. And when there's a whole big thing underneath this iceberg, and that's where God's heart lives and where we all miss the mark because we're too busy responding to the top piece, okay, that is not getting to people's hearts, okay? So we have to be really careful that we're not living at the top of the iceberg, but that we step back and with the grace of God, see what's underneath. And so when we create that compassionate, curious, calm response, calm relationship that invites these questions, then we can get to the bottom of the iceberg. But if we just live at the top, we miss quite a bit. And I'm guilty of that all the time. I respond to the top and I miss the bottom, okay? All right, so this is a quote from Anne Lamott. It says, you don't have to chop. You don't always have to chop with the sword of truth. You can point with it too, okay? So if the sword of truth is just there to cut people down versus to point people to the truth, to Christ, okay? And again, we've missed the heart of the relationship. Like 2 slides and then we'll be done and get you going to lunch. So how do we keep the relationship and the conversation going? We have to be prepared for challenges. Seize natural curiosity and look for teachable moments. Not every moment is a teachable moment, but when there is a teachable moment and it's there and it's ripe for the taking, seize it. But don't turn every moment into a teachable moment. Avoid overreacting when caught off guard. When I talk to adolescents, the number one reason they tell me they don't talk to their parents about things is because their parents overreact. Their parents overreact is the number one. The second was I don't think they care, which again, it's pretty hard to hear. Okay, I actually don't think they'll care. But those always live at the top. Don't be afraid to say I don't know. When you don't know the answer, can we look it up together? Can we explore this? Your parents don't need, our kids don't need parents who are experts. They need parents who are invested in relationship, who care about their heart. They don't need expert theologians who know every question. And yes, we ought to be prepared, but the point isn't that we're walking textbooks. That's never going to be the case. And then to maintain open communication. I know there was a question earlier about our kids' spirituality, and there was research that shows what maintains our children's spirituality, healthy spirituality. There's 3 key components that they found. It's not a part of the talk, but it's a little bonus. It is conversations, communication that was open, honest, and frequent. Open, honest, and frequent communication. So if you're talking about spirituality, it's a part of life, there's curiosity again, there's honesty, and there's frequent communication. It builds up our adolescents' spirituality. All right, one last slide. Okay, this is a quote by Preston Sprinkle. He says, if the world outloves the church, and this always breaks my heart, if the world outloves the church, and even though it's a broken love at times, but it feels quite a lot like love, then we have implicitly nudged our children away from the loving arms of Christ. So if the world outloves our homes, if the world outloves our Sunday school rooms, our relationship with our children, then we have basically given our children over to the world and taken them out of Christ's arms, which is, it's hard to fathom what that really means. So bring us back to the very beginning, that you are the parent, I am the parent, my child needs, and that the relationship and the quality of the relationship is ultimately what matters, okay? As we talk about sexuality, to know God, to know myself, and to know my child. So thank you all for allowing me to share and to take this time. We are a little bit behind schedule, but hopefully not too far off. So what I'm going to ask is that if you can now go and pick up your children from childcare, and then we will have 45 minutes for lunch. So hopefully that's sufficient time to come, and hopefully there's still some leftover coffee. And if you are a parent of a junior high or high school student, you are here in the main church. And if you are a parent of an elementary student, you are in the chapel. Okay, and you get to pick if you're somewhere in between or have one of each. All right, thank you all so much.